Okay. So welcome everyone. My name is Michelle Habasi, and I'm a member of the Analyst and Associate Board, which is an organization of young professionals under the parent organization, Financial Executives International. So our goal is to connect aspiring professionals and recent graduates to current professionals who are experts in their field. Welcome back to our interview series. And today I have with me Professor Paul Hawkinson, who teaches at North Park University. Thank you so much for sitting with me. And will you tell me a little bit about yourself and your career?
Sure. Yeah. Thanks for having me, Michelle. Good to be with you. Yeah. So I have a long and winding career. Hopefully, something that each of you can find some resonance with. So I went to North Park University, where I have the privilege of teaching now. So kind of a full circle story. I grew up in Chicago, product of the Chicago public school system. And I was an accounting and political science major, and went into work in accounting. Went to work ultimately at Deloitte. At that time, it was Deloitte and Touche in the early '90s, and worked there for about 3 years. And then went back to grad school. Realized that accounting was a wonderful footing for a business career, but probably not where I wanted to spend my life. And so I went back to Northwestern's Kellogg Graduate School of Management in the mid '90s, and I studied finance. And at that time, it was in advance of the tech boom, and almost all MBA graduates were taking one of two paths, going into either management consulting or investment banking. And I realized something about myself, and that is I have a pretty short attention span. And so I saw management consultants that were going to sit in the middle of Iowa studying some payment processing system at some company for about 9 months. And I realized I'd be paralyzed in that role for about 8.5 months. And I had some quantitative gifting. And so I kind of happened into the land of investment banking. I was fortunate enough to get a job at a firm that would ultimately become Deutsche Bank, would be acquired by Deutsche Bank. And that set me on about a 17-year journey in investment banking, where I did merger and acquisition work, financing work, worked a lot with private equity firms, mostly with industrial companies. So in advising industrial manufacturing businesses on who to acquire, what to sell, how to finance themselves, and had a career at Deutsche Bank and then Bank of America, and then ultimately BMO Capital Markets, part of the Bank of Montreal. So it's kind of the beginning of a good joke. I've worked for the Germans, the Americans, and the Canucks, and I don't know what the punchline is, but I really had a wonderful career in investment banking. And ultimately in 2012, I had the job that I thought that I always wanted, which was running an investment banking group at BMO Capital Markets. And it was a big job. I had some wonderful people around me. And the honest reality is I got to that point in my life where I realized that my job was overwhelming in terms of personal demands. And I have 4 kids, and my 2 older kids were getting into high school, and I wanted to be more present. And so I left it long before it made sense to leave that world economically, really because I wanted to pursue things that mattered a little bit more to me. And so in 2012, I tried to think about whatever my gifts are in creative deal making and finance, and how I could redeem that for something other than myself. And so the short story, Michelle, is that since 2012, I've done a little bit of everything. I've invested in little startup companies. I have served as the CFO even of our church denomination, and done a lot of kind of deal making through the church and the affiliates that it owned. I've had the privilege of teaching, which is a great intersection of bringing that experience back into the classroom. I've started some companies. I'm in the process, which I know we'll talk about, of starting a nonprofit lending platform. And so really the way I would describe it is a winding journey that ultimately has has created just a portfolio of things that I care about that are kind of at the intersection of creative finance and mission, if you will. And so, yeah, a little bit of my story. It's a huge gift to be back at your alma mater, teaching, spending time with students like you, Michelle, and even teaching in the same rooms that I was in, almost 30 years ago now.
Yeah, that definitely is a long journey for sure.
Yeah.
Definitely took
Yeah.
time. So I know you mentioned it a little bit about your startup, and I know it's called Transform Capital. So can you explain a little bit about what Transform Capital is?
Yeah. So, while I was in the for-profit world, I sat on a number of nonprofit boards, and so really gained some perspective on some of the beautiful dimensions of nonprofits, as well as some of the travails, right? Some of the struggle of sustainability. And I would say, so fundamentally, Transform Capital is a 501c3 nonprofit lending platform. So one of our taglines is that Transform Capital is a lending movement that makes no sense, CENTS. And here's where it came from. I grew up in the city, and I spent a lot of time on the south and west sides playing basketball in high school and seeing some of the realities of underserved communities. It wasn't my lived experience, but I had teammates that really lived in some very difficult circumstances. And so then I went off to Wall Street. I've always had the desire to serve, right, and to somehow bring those two worlds together. And so a couple of years ago, we started talking about the issue of asset ownership and how people like me have been able to own any asset we want, to have access to market-based capital. And when you look at discrimination in our country, in many ways, not just in financial terms, but finances matter, right? And for a long, long time, there have been underserved communities with incredible people that have not had access to capital. And the power of owning an asset, whether it's a home or a small business over 50 years, generates a huge amount of generational advantage. And so the idea came to spur economic ownership for others. And so originally we thought of a venture capital firm. Maybe we would invest alongside entrepreneurs in underserved communities. And then we pivoted off that because we don't want to own anything. We want to promote ownership in the hands of those who have not traditionally owned assets. And so we realized to do that, you need access to market rate loans. And as many of you know, in many underserved communities, there is historic discrimination of the big banks, as well as kind of the ravages of payday loan stores and currency exchanges and informal financing networks. And so we started to look at filling a middle ground where we would have a nonprofit community that would lend money at market rates, and not only lend money, but also come alongside and bring our networks to bear for the benefit of people building businesses in communities, and walk alongside them and encourage that journey of asset ownership. Because sometimes capital isn't enough. Sometimes there are things that we can do to really serve others and help them increase their accounting efficiency or increase their marketing strategy and or their distribution. And so that's the genesis of the idea. And so a couple distinctives of it. One is that there are many nonprofit community lenders. Often they're called CDFIs, Community Development Finance Institutions. And they do incredible work. But one of the issues is that their funding predominantly comes from loans from investors, loans from big banks, loans from the federal government. And that just creates a lot of complexity. It gives you regulations on investor regulations. You also have to worry about liquidity. Can I serve this family with a mortgage because I owe Michelle her interest check next Friday, or Bank of America needs $2 million back. And so by being a 501c3, we're eliminating all of that complexity. All of the capital that we raise is tax-deductible donation, so we don't owe it back to you. And so it eliminates a lot of regulatory complexity and cost. The second element is the last thing we wanted to do is to go into an underserved community and pretend like we have the answer, right? You always want to work through organizations that have long been serving the community, that have great credibility in the community. And so we didn't put up a website and say, please apply for a loan. We're working 100% through organizations, mostly nonprofits, who have long been serving communities in housing formation and business formation. And so they've been developing relationships with wonderful families for, years. And we just step in, provide market rate capital, and also network access to help these women and men in these communities begin to ignite flourishing and some economic advantage. And so that's the basic model. And the cool thing is that because of the way we've constructed it, I have the privilege of teaching strategy and finance at North Park. And so it occurred to me that I should probably think creatively about this platform. And so when you look at the dimensions of, real estate, we don't have any facility. Capital, we don't have any cost of capital because we're a nonprofit. Labor, we don't have any compensation. All of us are bringing ourselves as volunteers to this work and using our network. So there's a lot of dimensions where we're minimizing the cost of what we're doing. And the cool thing about that is that as we put loans into the market, our clients realize that by paying back the loans, they're not making it possible for Michelle to have a return. They're actually making it possible for the next homeowner or the next business owner in that community to thrive. And so we actually believe that literally in this, our first year of operation, we'll have recurring revenue from our loan portfolio sufficient to cover 100% of our operating costs, which is pretty remarkable if you spend time in the nonprofit space. So I'll stop there. That's a little bit of a vignette on Transform Capital, but I'm excited about it because I think wherever you're at in your career, your dream is eventually to intersect whatever your gifts are and something that kind of serves someone other than yourself. And that's the intersection for me, is being able to teach, and then being able to develop this platform kind of brings my experiences together in kind of a cool way.
Yeah, that was something that I had never heard of, a nonprofit lending. So it was very cool for me to hear you mention that in class. So I know you mentioned your journey brought you from all the for-profits into the nonprofit sector. So what were some of the biggest changes that you saw moving from the nonprofit or to the nonprofit sector after working for-profits?
Yeah, I think the mutuality, the similarities are far more than the differences, in my opinion. And how much the nonprofit world can learn from the for-profit space, and how much the for-profit space can learn from the nonprofit space. Sometimes we have a tendency to think about all the innovation coming from the for-profit space, and I've seen some incredible innovation in the nonprofit space. And so, a couple of thoughts on that. The world has moved kind of these two markets together. So for-profits, through corporate social responsibility, ESG, diversity and inclusion, are more focused on doing business in more than a single bottom line, right? And so they're moving more toward care for communities. And nonprofits are constantly trying to figure out how to care for their communities in a profitable way, right? That is sustainable. And, it's very unusual that a nonprofit would have, more than 50% of its of its support in recurring revenue or income. And so they're very, very reliant, over reliant on donations every year, right? And people filling the gap. And so, so I think this convergence is really interesting. And so I think the for-profit space can learn a lot about serving communities in ways that are impactful and not just checking a box on a corporate checklist about what we need to do in order to be viewed as responsive to our community by the marketplace. And so we've all seen, examples on LinkedIn and beyond where something happens in the world and you think of all that we've gone through in the last year and a half, and a company puts up some pitchy, slogan about how they care, let's say about diversity, equity, and inclusion. And then someone else is very quick to point out, thank you for your slogan, but let me see your top 20 leaders in your company and how that actually reflects, what you're talking about. So the for-profit world has a long way to go in terms of learning about real community service and impact and caring for people. On the nonprofit side, I would say that one thing that jumps out to me is we have far, far too many nonprofits. We have far too many nonprofits that are not sustainable. And Michelle, I know you see it at North Park as well, especially in your generation. Everyone has a desire to kind of have their own thing. And so whether, they may have a deep heart for homelessness or something else, and their first inclination sometimes is to begin their own nonprofit. And the last thing a world needs is another unsustainable nonprofit. And so the best thing to do is to do your work and figure out who is really doing it well and to join them and to learn. And maybe you will identify a niche that's not being served and then go form something. But I would say the nonprofit space needs to be quicker to embrace consolidation or mergers or even closure. To be honest, there are just too many nonprofits chasing what will be a dwindling philanthropic pool of capital because giving patterns are changing with the younger generation, and ultimately being more focused on who we serve. Right, if we're a nonprofit and we're serving food deserts in Chicago. Ultimately, the best thing for who we serve might be to merge with another nonprofit and consolidate costs and really make sure that we're serving people better. So I think the nonprofit space can be quicker to look at partnerships with other nonprofits. I've been surprised in the nonprofit space at all the same issues that exist in the for-profit space. You would think the nonprofit space would be much more collaborative. And actually, that's not the case. They compete in every way because they're competing for dollars and for funding. And so, it's a long-winded way of saying I think there are just a lot of similarities, and I think there's a lot of benefit of learning on both sides. And I don't think there is a right or wrong model. Nonprofit, for-profit, we thought about both as we worked on TC. I think the key is sustainability. How can you build sustainability either for your product or service or sustainability for your mission in a nonprofit sense? And as long as you come to a structure that allows you to do that, I think you're in a good place.
Thank you for that answer.
You're welcome.
Well, that kind of wraps up our interview. Thank you so much. I know your answers about your journey definitely soothe my nerves just because as a about to be grad, I'm a little nervous about where I'm going to end up. So it's reassuring to hear.
Yeah, well, let me just say on that as well, I have a recently graduated college senior, I have a junior in college, and then I have a couple kids who are younger, and I get it. Coming to North Park every day, this is not the college experience, and you guys are coming into a strange land, and I know there's pressure, but you have to realize it's not you. It's the reality of the world that you're walking into right now. This is going to pass, And, the one thing I would encourage you with is, typically if you graduate and you have a 6-month period of time where, you're not employed and, it begins to look odd on your resume, none of that is kind of in the mix today, right? The world realizes it's in a strange place. It's hard. You really have to, Michelle knows this, I talk about it a lot. Um, if you're sitting in your room and hitting send on Indeed.com, it's a waste of time. You need to be out with people, networking, spending time with people, getting them to hand off your resume. And sometimes it doesn't feel as productive to be out there just having conversations with people, but that's actually where jobs come from. And so give yourself some grace. It's a weird time. Everyone is in it together, but realize that it only takes one conversation with one person who resonates with your story to begin. And once you begin, right, this is the hardest phase, getting in. And once you get in, then your network grows. Someone leaves the firm and they bring you along because they enjoyed working with you, and your long and strange journey will begin just like mine did. So if I can do it, you guys can do it. So keep networking, and give yourself some grace. It's all going to work out.
All right. Thank you so much. I know our viewers will appreciate your advice. So,
Absolutely.
all right. Thank you so much for meeting with me, and thank you guys for watching.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Take care, Michelle.